it's a fallacy to say the bigger, stronger party always wins a war. That's ridiculous. We know from history that isn't true. The U.S. lost in Vietnam. The Soviets lost in Afghanistan. The U.S. lost in Afghanistan after 20 years. Weaker parties routinely defeat stronger parties. Weaker countries routinely defeat stronger countries in war. This is about national will and political will. And Ukraine has it. To this point, Russia has it as well. And so this is a contest of wills, and it'll be a contest of wills until one side decides that it can get a better deal at the bargaining table than it can on the battlefield. And to this point, neither side believes that.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Kartol Sharashenica. Today I'm joined by Colonel Bob Hamilton to discuss the ongoing Ukraine peace negotiations. Colonel Hamilton, first of all, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. Let me start with your overall observation. Like, how do you see the Ukraine peace process developing at this moment?
Well, I think there's a two-track peace process, right? There's the U.S. process, which seems to be engagement with Russia independently of engagement with Ukraine, and often leaving Europe out of it altogether. That process is probably going to lead nowhere because the U.S.-Russian plan was a non-starter for any of Ukraine's European partners or for the Ukrainians themselves. The revised plan, after the meeting between Witkoff and Kushner and the Ukrainian delegation in Florida last week, it was unacceptable to the Russians, right? So I think the U.S.-led peace process is a dead end. There's a European-led process that incorporates more of Ukraine's interests that may lead to a settlement, but Russia will reject that. I mean, Russia rejected the U.S.-led process, which was much more favorable to Russia. So Russia will reject the European process. So I don't actually see either of them as likely to result in a ceasefire anytime soon. But the European-led process is far more realistic and far more grounded in morality, ethics, laws of war, and everything else than the U.S.-led process, which I think is far too favorable to Russia, frankly.
Are we getting any closer to a deal?
No, I mean, we're not, because Russia doesn't want a deal. Russia believes it can win, and I don't think Russia believes it can win on the battlefield, because it can't, not anytime soon, and not at any acceptable cost, even to Russia. But I think Russia believes it can either split the U.S. and Europe, or split the U.S. from Europe and Ukraine, and that the U.S. will walk away from the process, and that the U.S. will use the leverage it has to try to force Europe and Ukraine into an unfair settlement. I think that's the Russian plan. And that requires just rejecting peace proposals until, again, the Russian hope is that the Trump administration gets frustrated, walks away from the peace, from the negotiations, and tries to force Europe and Ukraine into an unfair settlement.
President Trump said Russia has the upper hand because it's bigger and stronger. And he also said President Zelensky has to start accepting things because he's losing. So from like military and political perspective, what's your take on that?
Look, it's a fallacy to say the bigger, stronger party always wins a war. That's ridiculous. We know from history that isn't true. The U.S. lost in Vietnam. The Soviets lost in Afghanistan. The U.S. lost in Afghanistan after 20 years. Weaker parties routinely defeat stronger parties. Weaker countries routinely defeat stronger countries in war. This is about national will and political will. And Ukraine has it. To this point, Russia has it as well. It's hard to speak of national will in Russia just because the Russian people aren't consulted about this war and are frankly propagandized to the point where they do support it. Many Russians do support the war, but what they're not seeing is the true cost of the war. They're not seeing what's actually unfolding on the ground in Ukraine. They're not seeing the 1 million+ casualties that their military has sustained. They're not seeing the war crimes and the murder of civilians that the Russian armed forces are inflicting on Ukraine every day. So they're seeing a very sanitized version of the war, And frankly, there's such a cost for speaking out against the war in Russia that we don't know what Russian national will is. We know what Russian political will is, and that revolves around Putin. We do know what Ukrainian national will is, and we do know what Ukrainian political will is. And those have both been affected because it's been a long, drawn out, bloody war. But to this point, I've seen signs of frustration in Ukrainian society. I've seen signs of frustration and exhaustion in the political class in Ukraine, but I've not seen any signs of wanting to give up or wanting to end the war on any terms possible or end the war on Russia's terms. And so this is a contest of wills, and it'll be a contest of wills until one side decides that it can get a better deal at the bargaining table than it can on the battlefield. And to this point, neither side believes that.
At this point, like, what options does President Zelensky actually have in those negotiations?
I think President Zelensky's, I think his plan is to rely as much as he can on the Europeans. Understand that the U.S. is not a partner in these negotiations. He has to say the right things. He's got to be very careful how he characterizes the Trump administration, the U.S. and President Trump. And so he's said all the right things. He knows he can't be critical. He knows he can't express frustration. He knows Trump will take it personally. And he knows Trump is vindictive enough that he could do something like the U.S. did last spring after the first Oval Office meeting in February, when the U.S. cut off intelligence sharing and paused military assistance. The U.S. doesn't give Ukraine direct military assistance anymore. In other words, under the Trump administration, we've not approved any new assistance, but there's still billions of dollars of assistance in the pipeline. So this is stuff that was authorized by Congress and appropriated by Congress under the Biden administration and is still being procured and delivered to Ukraine. So the Trump administration could pause that. And it could also pause the agreement for Europe to buy U.S. equipment and then forward it, give it to Ukraine. And so the U.S. still has leverage. Unfortunately, the U.S. still has leverage over this process. So Zelensky has to be careful. He's got to keep the Trump administration at least neutral or on side if possible. But I think his best bet, and I think his plan, is to rely on the Europeans, which is why he met with Merz and Starmer and Macron yesterday. I believe it was yesterday. But yeah, so he's got to rely on European political will and European just seriousness and understanding of the stakes of this conflict in order to get a decent outcome.
Based on the new U.S. national security strategy, how do you see the future of transatlantic relations?
Look, there was nothing good in the new national security strategy for transatlantic relations at all. Europe understands now that from the security perspective, it's alone. The United States cannot be, at least under this administration, the United States cannot be counted on to be a reliable partner for Europe in defending its own security. In fact, the national security strategy, in the same strategy where it said we're okay with ideological and philosophical differences, and we will not try to democratize or meddle in the internal affairs of other countries, meaning Russia and China specifically, the strategy actually advocated for interfering in the internal affairs of our European allies and partners to try to bolster or prop up what the Trump administration calls patriotic parties, which are actually right-wing populist parties that try to dismantle democracy from inside. So for Europe, I guess it's a wake-up call, but many Europeans probably were not shocked because they had heard these words come out of the mouths of Trump administration officials. But to see it in writing in an official White House document, I think was a little, even that was a little shocking. Even having heard those words, once you see them in writing, signed by the President of the United States, reflecting official U.S. policy, I think it was a wake-up call for Europe.
President Trump says Europeans need to do more, right? So are they doing enough?
Europe is giving more aid to Ukraine, and Europe has given more aid to Ukraine than the United States has, especially since the Trump administration came into office. The U.S. has given no new aid to Ukraine. Europe's problem is one of capacity, chronic underinvestment in defense for decades. So there are things the Europeans just can't provide to the Ukrainians that only the U.S. can. This is why we call it the PURL, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, the agreement between the U.S. and its European allies that the Europeans can buy U.S. equipment and give it to Ukraine, because that requires U.S. approval. If you're going to, U.S. equipment being shipped to another country requires the U.S. to approve that. So as long as that program stays in place and Europe is willing to spend the money and the U.S. defense industrial base can produce the equipment at a high enough rate to supply Ukraine's needs, then Ukraine can still be supplied. But it's going to take a lot of spending and a lot of political will on the part of European governments that, frankly, need to do a better job of explaining to their publics why it's important that Russia lose this war and Ukraine win this war.
Right. So why is it important?
Well, because Russia is an acute militarized threat to European security, period. Russia has invaded. It invaded Georgia in 2008. It invaded Ukraine in 2014. It intervened in Syria in 2015. And it invaded Ukraine again in 2022. It has been a serial violator of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors since the end of since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right? I mean, we talk about the 21st century invasions, but it also intervened in Georgia, as you know, in 1992 in Abkhazia. It intervened in Transnistria. So in Moldova. And so Russia is an acute militarized threat to European security, which, at least in my opinion, because of the size, the population, and the concentration of resources and the economic power of Europe, European security is indivisible from American security. So that's why it's important that Ukraine win this war and Russia lose this war. Frankly, neither European governments nor the U.S. government have done a very good job of explaining to their publics why this is important. I think the people would support it. And most of the polls indicate that both European and American publics support increased aid to Ukraine, or at least sustained aid to Ukraine, and support the idea of Ukraine winning the war and believe that Russia is the aggressor here. So, and that's without a sustained public relations campaign on behalf of any of the European or U.S. governments to explain to the publics why this matters. But if that were to occur, I think you'd see even greater public support, which could then translate into greater political will. If governments know that they have the people behind them and the people are willing to sacrifice a little bit in terms of increased taxes or reduced services in order to support Ukraine, then governments will have the will, more political will to do this once they know that their people are behind them and they won't pay a political price.
What are the wider security implications of the outcome of this process? Like, how might it change the current international order?
You mean the entire global order?
Yes.
Well, that's a good question. I think one of the major questions about the outcome of this war is where the United States stands when it's over. So there's two interrelated questions. One is, how does the war end? In some sort of stalemate, in a de facto Russian victory and a de facto Ukrainian victory. What role does the United States play in bringing that process about, or that outcome about? And then what role does the United States play in European security post-war? To this point, given what the national security strategy that the Trump administration just released, given what it says, it looks like the role of the U.S. in European security will be radically diminished, that the U.S. is going to retrench, is going to be focused on the Western Hemisphere, and then also on the Indo-Pacific regions, and appears to be willing to essentially cede a Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union, probably minus the Baltics, which are already NATO members, and to assume that Europe and Russia will come to some sort of what they call in the NSS, the National Security Strategy, strategic stability, restoring strategic stability. And so I think the assumption on the part of the U.S. is that the Ukraine war ends, however it ends. Europe takes a greater role for its own security, and that means it spends much more on defense. Now, the U.S. wants Europe to spend more on defense by buying American equipment. I think that's unlikely to happen. I think what you're likely to see, because the Europeans now don't believe they can trust the United States or rely on the United States as the sole security partner or provider. So you're probably likely to see a long-term European reinvestment or reinvigoration in its own defense industrial base, and Europe then building some of these weapons and systems that right now it can only get from the United States, building its own versions of those and building them at scale so that Europe can defend itself. I think that's the likely outcome of the combined effects of the war in Ukraine and the new U.S. national security strategy.
What gives you the most hope in those developments?
I hope that Europe has awakened. I hope that Europe will emerge as a strategic actor and a strategic counterweight to Russia on the continent of Europe. I hope that eventually the United States will return to its traditional role of a more sort of internationalist role, where the United States, look, one thing about the Trump national security strategy, I think that is pragmatic and realistic, is it says we have to match our ends or our objectives with our means or resources. Okay. And the Trump strategy is frankly correct that many previous national security strategies, they set these lofty objectives, but they really weren't willing to put the means or the resources toward achieving those objectives. And so this strategy at least claims to be more pragmatic and means-based. And that means matches means and ends together. It's a little more restrained and a little more realistic. Excuse me. So what I hope is that the U.S. will return to a more internationalist policy, meaning it will care more about NATO, it will care more about allies and partners, it will care more about European security, but it could be a little more restrained in terms of use of military power overseas. I think that part of the Trump national security strategy is pragmatic and realistic. Now, we seem to be using a whole lot of military power in our own in the Western Hemisphere against things that are not national security threats. They're law enforcement and intelligence issues, migration, drug trafficking, things like that. So I think that's a mistake. But I do think that the strategy is a little bit more pragmatic and restrained than some previous strategies. And I think if that were to carry forward, but the U.S. were to bring some of that pragmatism and restraint, but then return to its more internationalist role, and a role that actually cared about international institutions and alliances and partners and things like that, I think you could see a more constructive U.S. role in the world. And that gives me hope. That and the fact that Europe may emerge as a real strategic actor, a military and economic heavyweight. Look, a Europe that is a true strategic actor, there's no better partner for the United States anywhere in the world. There's no other country or block of countries that brings the population, the economic power, that has the potential military power, and aligns with the U.S. in terms of values and interests more than the Europeans do. That's just a fact.
Well, thank you so much again, Colonel Hamilton. It was a great honor to have you with us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching. This was Colonel Hamilton. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more, and see you next time.